The Galactic Senate had existed for 3,000 years without a single day of silence. Until now, 12 great empires ruled the stars through a careful balance of power and fear. And each one commanded enough firepower to burn entire solar systems into ash. And each one watched the others with hungry eyes, waiting for any sign of weakness. The Veth Dominion controlled the galactic core with their massive dreadnoughts that could crack planets like eggs. And their admirals wore the bones of conquered species as medals of honor. And their empire stretched across 10,000 worlds that had learned to kneel or burn. The Solari Communion spread across the eastern spiral arm, like a plague of connected minds. And their billions of drones shared one consciousness that stretched across the void. And their high fleets darkened the skies of any world that dared to resist their expansion. The Koroth Empire built their civilization on war and blood. And their warriors lived only for battle, and their children learned to kill before they learned to speak. And their fleets had never known defeat in 800 years of conquest. The Pale Assembly watched from their ancient worlds at the galaxy's edge. And they had existed longer than any other species could remember. And their knowledge stretched back millions of years to times when the current empires were nothing but primitive beasts crawling through mud. These were the powers that ruled known space. And they had fought and negotiated and threatened each other for millennia. And they believed they understood every danger the universe could offer. They were wrong. The anomaly appeared on a quiet day in the void, beyond the galactic rim, in a region every empire had marked as dead space. A cosmic graveyard where no life could exist, where every probe sent had vanished without trace, where even the Pale Assembly feared to look. A single vessel emerged from that darkness, like a ghost rising from its grave. The ship was small by galactic standards, barely 2 kilometers from bow to stern, and its hull was dark and angular and covered in strange patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. And it moved through space with a grace that made the watching admirals grip their armrests in sudden fear. When the vessel broadcast its identification signal, every translation system in the galaxy struggled with the alien language. And computers that could decode 10,000 tongues stumbled over simple words. And when the meaning finally became clear, every throne room fell silent. The species called themselves human, and they came from a world called Earth. And they had traveled from beyond the dead zone to introduce themselves to their galactic neighbors. Admiral Keth Voron of the Veth Dominion received the news in his command fortress above the conquered world of Yenis Prime. And he had crushed rebellions and burned cities and watched entire species beg for mercy without feeling anything but satisfaction. But something about this report made his 4 hearts beat faster with an emotion he had not felt in centuries: fear. He ordered his fastest scout ships to investigate, and they jumped across the void to observe this newcomer from a safe distance. And what they reported back made him forget how to breathe. The human ship's hull defied every scanning technology the Veth possessed, and their sensors could not determine what materials had been used in its construction. And energy readings suggested the vessel contained a power source that burned hotter than the core of a star. And the ship's mass readings made no sense, because something that small should not weigh that much. Other empires sent their own observers. And within hours, a fleet of 300 vessels from 12 different species surrounded the human ship at what they believed was a safe distance. And they watched and waited and tried to understand what they were seeing. The human captain transmitted a message then, and her face appeared on every screen in the observation fleet. And she was small and strange-looking with soft skin and eyes that held no fear despite being surrounded by the combined might of galactic civilization. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she smiled as she spoke. "We come in peace," she said. And her voice was calm and warm like a mother speaking to frightened children. "We have watched your galaxy for a very long time, and we have decided that we are ready to meet you. And we hope that we can become friends. The Veth Patrol commander laughed at these words and ordered his cruiser to move closer to the human vessel, to show these newcomers the proper respect owed to the Dominion. And his weapons officers powered up their plasma cannons just to make the message clear. What happened next would echo through history for 10,000 years. The human ship's weapons array activated without warning, and targeting systems that should not have been possible locked onto every vessel in the observation fleet simultaneously, and 300 warships from 12 different empires suddenly found themselves painted for death in the span of a single heartbeat. Not one after another in sequence, like any known targeting computer, all of them at once, as if time itself had bent to the human ship's will. The Veth commander froze with his hand raised to give the attack order, and sweat dripped down his scaled face as he realized that his ship and every ship around him could be destroyed before any of them could fire a single shot. And he understood with terrible clarity that the balance of power he had known his entire life had just shattered like glass. Captain Vasquez spoke again, and her smile had not changed, but something in her eyes had grown cold and hard like steel forged in the heart of a dying sun. "We come in peace," she repeated, and her words carried across the void to every listening ear. "But we came prepared for the alternative. I want you all to understand something very important about my people before we continue." She paused and looked directly into the camera as if she could see every admiral and emperor and war chief watching her transmission. "We are alone," she said. "One ship and one crew and nothing else. And we chose to come here this way because we wanted you to understand what one human vessel can do. And we wanted you to imagine what would happen if we ever decided to send more." The observation fleet hung motionless in the void. 300 warships frozen in place by the words of a single human woman commanding a single human ship, and across the galaxy, in throne rooms and command centers and senate chambers, the rulers of 12 great empires looked at each other and said nothing at all. The age of silence had begun. News of the human ship spread through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. And within days, every species in known space had heard the story of the vessel that could target 300 warships in a single heartbeat. And fear began to grow in places that had never known fear before. Admiral Kethvorin paced the floor of his command chamber like a caged predator, and his claws scraped against the metal with each step. And his officers watched him with nervous eyes as he demanded answers that nobody could provide. How did they hide from us? He snarled at his intelligence chief, and his voice echoed off the walls like thunder. How did an entire species develop in our galaxy without anyone noticing them? And how did they build technology that makes our greatest weapons look like children's toys? The intelligence chief trembled and offered theories that grew more terrifying with each word. And he spoke of the dead zone beyond the galactic rim where every probe had vanished. And he suggested that perhaps the probes had not malfunctioned at all. And perhaps something had been watching and waiting and learning about galactic civilization for longer than anyone wanted to imagine. Kethvorin dismissed him with a wave of his clawed hand and stared out the viewport at the stars he had once believed he would conquer. And for the first time in his long and bloody career, he wondered if conquest was still possible in a galaxy that contained humans. The Solari Communion experienced something even stranger than fear. Their hive queens sat in their birthing chambers deep beneath the surface of their homeworld, and their minds stretched across billions of connected drones, and they searched every memory and every record in their million-year history for any mention of a species called human. They found nothing. The Communion had cataloged every intelligent species they had ever encountered, and their records stretched back to times when most current empires were still learning to use fire. And yet these humans appeared nowhere in their vast archive of knowledge. And this absence terrified the Hive Queens more than any weapon ever could. How could a species remain hidden from the communion's sight? And how could they develop such power in complete isolation? And what else might be lurking in the dark spaces between the stars that the communion had never noticed? For the first time in their history, the Hive Queens disagreed with each other, and their perfect unity cracked as some demanded immediate attack while others counseled patience. And the billions of drones connected to their minds felt the discord like a sickness spreading through their shared consciousness. But it was the pale assembly that reacted most strangely of all the fully to all the tumbly. Assembly had watched the galaxy change for longer than any other species could comprehend, and they had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore, and they had survived catastrophes that had erased entire civilizations from existence, and they had learned patience that other species could not imagine when their observers transmitted data on the human vessel. The ruling council convened in their ancient chamber carved from living crystal that had grown for 10 million years, and they reviewed the information in silence that stretched for hours. And then they did something they had not done in 12,000 years. They recalled their fleets. Every warship that assembly possessed received orders to return home immediately, and patrol vessels abandoned their routes, and battle groups withdrew from contested borders. And within days, the Pale Assembly had pulled back to their core worlds like a creature retreating into its shell. The other empires watched this withdrawal with confusion and growing alarm, and ambassadors sent urgent messages demanding explanation. And the Assembly speaker finally agreed to address the Galactic Senate. She was ancient beyond measure, and her pale skin stretched tight over bones that had seen 1,000 centuries pass, and her eyes held memories of times before any other species in the chamber had existed. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages. "We have seen this pattern before," she said, and the Senate chamber fell silent. "Not this species, but this shape of events. And I will tell you what we know, though it brings me no pleasure to speak of it." She paused and looked across the assembled representatives with something that might have been pity. 60 million years ago, before your ancestors had crawled from their oceans, a civilization ruled this galaxy that made our current empires look like insects building hills in the dirt. And they called themselves the Precursors, and they had mastered technologies that we still cannot understand. And they believed themselves to be eternal. The speaker's ancient hands trembled as she continued. Then a ship came from beyond known space. A single vessel with no identification and power readings that defied analysis. And the precursors in their arrogance attacked it without hesitation. And that was the beginning of the end. She closed her eyes as if the memory caused her physical pain. The harvesters came after that first ship, and we do not know how many there were. And we do not know where they originated, and we only know what they left behind. And that was nothing but ash and silence, and ruins that still dot the galaxy as monuments to a civilization that thought itself invincible. The Senate erupted in chaos as representatives shouted questions and demands. And the speaker waited for silence before she spoke again. "We do not know if these humans are connected to the harvesters, and we do not know if they are something new. And we only know that a single ship has emerged from the void with power beyond our understanding. And we have chosen to watch and wait rather than repeat the Precursor's fatal mistake." Meanwhile, the human vessel remained at the edge of known space, and Captain Vasquez answered every communication with polite and measured words. And she shared information about Earth with what seemed like honest transparency. And she waited with the patience of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. When a Yanari diplomat asked her what humanity wanted from the galaxy, she smiled that strange soft smile and tilted her head like a curious bird. "Just to talk," she said. And something flickered in her eyes that the diplomat could not identify. "For now, we only want to talk, and we want to learn about you. And we want you to learn about us." and then we will see what happens next." The diplomat ended the transmission with shaking hands and filed a report that recommended extreme caution. And across the galaxy, 12 empires that had spent millennia preparing for war with each other suddenly found themselves united in one shared emotion: uncertainty. And in her command chair aboard the human vessel, Captain Elena Vasquez watched the galaxy scramble to understand her. And she thought about the long journey that had brought humanity to this moment. And she remembered all the reasons why her people had come so far and built so much. Soon she would tell them. Soon the galaxy would understand why one human warship was enough. But for now, she let them wonder and worry and imagine the worst. Because fear was a useful tool when wielded correctly, and humanity had learned to wield every tool with deadly precision. The Pale Assembly opened their archives to the galaxy for the first time in recorded history, and scholars from every empire traveled to their ancient homeworld to study records that stretch back 60 million years. And what they found there changed everything they believed about the universe. The archives were carved into mountains of crystal that had grown slowly over eons. And each facet contained memories preserved through technologies that modern scientists could not replicate. And the Assembly's historians guided their visitors through halls of frozen time with patient voices and knowing eyes. The precursors had been real. They had ruled the galaxy when the current stars were young, and their civilization had spanned every corner of known space. And their technology had bordered on magic. And they had seeded worlds with life and moved stars like pieces on a game board and built wonders that still survived as ruins scattered across 10,000 worlds. The Assembly showed their visitors images preserved from that ancient time, and the representatives saw cities that floated in the hearts of gas giants, and ships that traveled between galaxies as easily as modern vessels jumped between stars, and beings of light and energy that had transcended physical form entirely. And then they showed them what came after. The harvesters had appeared without warning from the void between galaxies, and their first ship had been small and alone and seemingly harmless. And the precursors had destroyed it without hesitation because they feared nothing and believed themselves masters of all creation. That had been a mistake. More ships came after the first, and they were not small, and they were not harmless. And they carried weapons that could unmake matter itself. And they swept through the galaxy like a cleansing fire that left nothing but ash and silence in its wake. The war lasted less than a century. When it ended, the precursors were gone, and their great works lay in ruins. And the scattered survivors of younger species emerged from hiding to find a galaxy emptied of its masters. And they began the slow work of building new civilizations from the wreckage of the old. The Assembly had survived because they had hidden, and they had watched from the shadows as giants fell. And they had learned a lesson they never forgot. Some enemies cannot be defeated through strength alone. Captain Vasquez requested a meeting with the Assembly's historians after reviewing their archives, and she came alone to their ancient chamber. And she sat across from beings who had witnessed the death of gods. And she told them the truth about humanity. "We are not harvesters," she said. And her voice was soft but steady. "We are not descendants of precursors. And we are not ancient beings returning from exile. And we are something much simpler and much sadder than any of those things." She paused and took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "We are survivors," she said. "And we know exactly what you felt when you watched your galaxy burn because we watched our own people burn. And we learned the same lesson you did. And we made a promise that it would never happen again." The historians leaned forward with ancient eyes hungry for knowledge. And Vasquez began to tell humanity's story. Earth had not always been alone. 300 years ago, humanity had spread across their solar system like seeds scattered by the wind. And they had built colonies on moons and asteroids and planets. And 50 billion human souls had lived and worked and dreamed beneath alien skies. And they had believed their future was limitless. The colony on Mars had held 10 billion people in domed cities that stretched across red deserts. And they had terraformed the world slowly over generations. And children had been born there who had never seen Earth except in pictures. Europa's ocean colonies had pushed into the dark waters beneath the ice. And they had discovered wonders in the depths that changed human understanding of life itself. And they had built cities that glowed like jewels in the eternal night. Titan settlements had harvested the moon's abundant resources and built the shipyards that launched humanity toward the outer system. And they had dreamed of one day reaching the stars themselves. Then the silence came, something found them in the dark. And humanity never learned what it was. And the only thing they knew was the dying. It began with the outer colonies losing contact. And at first people assumed technical failures. And they sent ships to investigate, and those ships never returned. And then the dying spread inward like a plague racing toward the sun. Mars went dark in a single night. And 10 billion people simply stopped transmitting. And when the observation satellites finally showed images of the surface, there was nothing left but ruins and ash and silence. Europa followed, and Titan after that. And one by one, the lights of human civilization winked out across the solar system until only Earth remained. 50 billion people died in less than a year. And the survivors on Earth watched their species burn. And they screamed into the void for help that never came. And they searched for answers they never found. And they mourned losses too vast for the human heart to comprehend. Vasquez stopped speaking then. And tears ran down her face, though her voice remained steady. And the assembly historians understood that she was not merely recounting history, but reliving it, through memories passed down through generations of grief. "We never found out what killed them," she said. "We never learned where it came from or why it attacked. And we only knew that something in the universe had looked at humanity and decided we should not exist. And we were helpless to stop it." She wiped her eyes and lifted her chin with pride that had been forged in loss. "So we changed," she said. "We spent 300 years becoming something that could never be helpless again. And we built weapons that could crack worlds. And we designed ships that could survive the death of stars. And we created minds that could think faster than light. And we watched the galaxy and learned everything about every species that might one day threaten us." She met the historian's ancient eyes with a gaze that held no fear. "We came here alone because we wanted you to understand what we became. And we wanted you to see what one human vessel can do. And we wanted you to imagine what would happen if the thing that killed our people ever came back. And we wanted you to know that this time humanity would be ready." The assembly historian sat in silence for a long moment. And then the eldest among them bowed her head in a gesture of respect that her species had not offered to anyone in 10,000 years. "We understand," she said. "We remember what it means to watch your people die and feel powerless to stop it. And we honor your survival and your strength." She rose and extended her hand in a gesture Vasquez recognized from human custom. "Welcome to the galaxy," she said. "We have been waiting a very long time for someone like you." War Chief Drawn of the Koroth Empire did not believe in fear, and he did not believe in caution. And he certainly did not believe that a single ship from an unknown species could threaten the greatest military force the galaxy had ever known. He had conquered 18 species in his lifetime, and he wore their skulls on his armor as trophies of victory. And his name was spoken in terrified whispers on 100 worlds that had learned too late what Koroth warriors could do. When he heard the stories about the human vessel and watched the other empires scramble in panic, he laughed until his sides ached and called his war council to his flagship. "These humans are nothing," he declared. And his voice boomed through the chamber like thunder. "They have one ship and we have thousands. And they have made the mistake of showing the galaxy their weapon before they were ready to use it. And now we will take it from them." His advisors exchanged nervous glances, but none dared to disagree. Because Dron had killed the last advisor who questioned his judgment with his bare hands. And his claws were still stained with that foolish officer's blood. The war chief sent messages to every Koroth fleet commander in the Empire, and he ordered them to gather their forces at the border of the Dead Zone. And within weeks, he had assembled the largest armada the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. 800 warships hung in formation like predators waiting to strike. And each one bristled with weapons that could level cities in seconds. And their crews sang battle hymns as they prepared for the glory of conquest. And their blood burned with anticipation of the slaughter to come. Dron transmitted a message to the human vessel from his command throne, and his scarred face filled the screen as he addressed Captain Vasquez with contempt dripping from every word. "Little human," he growled, "your tricks have frightened weaker species, but the Koroth do not frighten. And we have come to claim your ship and your technology. And you will surrender now, or you will die screaming as your vessel burns around you." Vasquez appeared on his screen with that strange calm expression that seemed to be her default state. And she looked at the massive fleet arrayed against her with no more concern than if she were observing a group of children playing at war. "I understand," she said. And her voice was gentle, like a teacher speaking to a slow student. "You need to test us before you can believe what we are. And I want you to know that I hold no anger toward you for this. And I am going to give you one chance to turn your fleet around and go home." Dron laughed so hard that tears streamed down his face. And his officers joined him in mocking this tiny human who thought she could threaten an armada. "One chance," Vasquez repeated. And something changed in her eyes, and the laughter died in Koroth throats as they saw what lurked behind her gentle mask. "This is not a threat, War Chief. And this is not a boast. And this is mercy. And I hope you understand that when this is over." Dron snarled and cut the transmission and raised his clawed hand to give the attack order. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The human vessel moved through the Koroth fleet like a blade through water, and nothing the Koroth did could stop it or even slow it down. And their plasma cannons fired and missed targets that seemed to know where they would shoot before they pulled the triggers. And their missiles launched and detonated harmlessly against shields that glowed like captured starlight. The human ship's weapons fired in patterns that made no sense until you realized they were striking where ships would be, rather than where they were. And beams of energy that the Koroth sensors could not identify sliced through their hulls with surgical precision. And one by one the warships went dark, but they did not explode. The human vessel was not destroying the fleet. And Dron realized this with growing horror as he watched ship after ship lose power without a single hull breach. And he understood that Vasquez was proving a point with every disabled vessel. She could kill them all in seconds if she wanted. Instead, she was taking them apart like a parent removing dangerous toys from a child's hands. And she was doing it without harming a single crew member. And the message was clear to anyone with eyes to see. 800 warships drifted dead in space by the time the human vessel stopped firing. And not one of them had been destroyed, and not one Koroth warrior had died. And the only sounds on the communication channels were the stunned silence of soldiers who had never known defeat. Vasquez appeared on Dron's screen again, and his flagship hung powerless in the void with every system except life support disabled. And he could only stare at her with eyes that had finally learned what fear meant. "War Chief," she said. And her voice was still gentle, but now he understood what that gentleness cost her. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because this is the most important lesson you will ever learn." She leaned forward in her command chair. "We do not want war," she said. We have seen enough death to last us forever. And we have lost more than your species can imagine. And we have no desire to add Koroth bones to the mountain of grief we already carry." Her eyes hardened like steel cooling in ice water. "But if you force us to fight, we will make sure you survive to remember why that was a mistake. And we will leave you alive so you can tell your children and your children's children about the day you learned that some enemies cannot be defeated through strength alone." Drawn's claws dug into the arms of his throne as he struggled to find words. And his pride screamed at him to hurl defiance at this human who had humiliated the greatest fleet in the galaxy. But his survival instincts had finally woken from their long slumber. "What do you want?" he rasped. And his voice was rough with emotions he could not name. Vasquez smiled. And it was not a cruel smile or a mocking smile, but something sadder and wiser than Drawn had ever seen. "I want you to go home," she said. "I want you to tell your people what happened here today. And I want you to think very carefully about what kind of galaxy you want to live in. And then I want you to make better choices than the ones that brought you here." She paused and tilted her head. "Your power will be restored in 1 hour. And you will have enough fuel to return to Koroth space. And I hope when we meet again, it will be as something other than enemies." The transmission ended, and Drawn sat alone in the darkness of his powerless flagship. And he thought about everything he had believed about strength and power and conquest. 1 hour later, the lights came back on, and his engines hummed to life. And the war chief gave the only order he could give. "Take us home," he said. And his voice was quiet in a way his officers had never heard before. Behind them, the human vessel hung motionless in space. And Captain Vasquez watched the Koroth fleet limp away in silence. And she allowed herself one moment of grief for the violence she had been forced to demonstrate. Then she turned her attention to the future and the work that still remained. The galaxy had learned what humanity could do in war. And now it was time to show them what humanity could do in peace. 6 months after the human vessel first appeared at the edge of known space, Captain Elena Vasquez stood before the Galactic Senate and looked out at the assembled representatives of 12 empires who had spent millennia fighting each other. They were not fighting. Now the Great Chamber had been designed to intimidate visitors with its vast scale and the weight of history carved into every surface. And species that had conquered worlds and enslaved billions sat in their designated sections with pride and arrogance that stretched back countless generations, but today they were quiet. And they watched the small human woman at the podium with something none of them wanted to admit. They felt respect born from fear. Growing slowly into something else entirely, Vasquez wore a simple uniform with no medals or decorations, except a small patch on her shoulder that showed a blue and green planet surrounded by stars. And her gray hair was pulled back from a face lined with years and worry and hard-won wisdom. "Thank you for allowing me to address this assembly," she began, and her voice carried through the chamber without amplification. And every ear and auditory organ and sensory appendage turned toward her words. 6 months ago, I brought my ship into your galaxy and introduced myself. And since then you have learned much about humanity, and we have learned much about you. And I believe the time has come for us to speak plainly about the future." She paused and looked across the gathered representatives with eyes that had seen things they could not imagine. "My people suffered a tragedy 300 years ago. That nearly ended our existence. And we spent those 3 centuries preparing to make sure nothing like that could ever happen again. And we built ourselves into something that could survive anything the universe might throw at us." Her voice grew stronger. "But survival is not enough, and we learned that lesson too. And we understood that a galaxy full of species constantly fighting and conquering and destroying each other was a galaxy that would eventually produce something that could threaten us all." She gestured toward the representatives. "Your empires have spent millennia locked in conflict. And you have destroyed worlds and enslaved populations and committed atrocities that you have convinced yourselves were necessary for survival. And you have told yourselves that this is simply how the universe works. Her eyes hardened. You are wrong. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, but no one dared to interrupt. Humanity has come to offer you a choice. Vasquez continued. We can be your friends and your partners in building something better. Or we can be the force that prevents you from destroying yourselves and taking innocent species down with you. She listed the conditions humanity had developed over centuries of watching galactic civilization tear itself apart. There would be no more wars of extinction. And species could compete and argue and even fight. Limited conflicts, but the deliberate annihilation of entire peoples would no longer be tolerated by anyone. The slave markets would close, and the billions of sentient beings held in bondage across the galaxy would be freed. And any empire that continued to practice slavery would find itself facing consequences it could not survive. The practice of destroying inhabited worlds would end, and the weapons capable of such destruction would be dismantled. And the admirals who had ordered such attacks in the past would face justice for their crimes. These are not requests, Vasquez said. And her voice was calm but carried an edge that cut through any illusion of negotiation. These are the terms under which humanity will allow galactic civilization to continue operating. And any species that refuses to accept them will discover exactly how serious we are. The Veth representative rose from his seat with fury burning in his 4 eyes. You cannot dictate terms to empires that have existed for millennia, he snarled. Your people are newcomers to this galaxy, and you have no right to impose your values on civilizations far older than your own. Vasquez turned to face him without flinching. You are correct that we are newcomers, she said. And you are correct that your civilizations are older than ours. And you are correct that we have no right to impose our values on anyone. She smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression, but I did not say we have a right to do this, and I said we have the ability to do this. And the Korath learned 6 months ago what that ability means in practical terms. And I am offering you the chance to accept change peacefully rather than having it forced upon you. The chamber fell silent again as representatives remembered the images of 800 warships drifting, powerless in space. The vote that followed lasted 3 days as empires debated and threatened and bargained with each other. And in the end, the result was not unanimous, but it was decisive enough. The Galactic Senate accepted humanity's conditions by a margin of 9 empires to 3. And the dissenting empires were given 1 year to comply or face consequences that the resolution did not need to specify. Years passed, and the galaxy began to change. Human ambassadors appeared on worlds that had never known anything but war and oppression, and they brought technologies that could heal sick planets and feed starving populations and connect isolated species to the wider community of intelligent life. Human ships patrolled the borders between hostile empires and intervened when conflicts threatened to escalate beyond acceptable limits. And their presence alone was often enough to convince aggressive admirals to seek diplomatic solutions instead. The slave markets closed one by one as human investigators documented their crimes, and human engineers helped liberated populations rebuild their shattered societies. And billions of beings who had known nothing but chains learned what freedom meant for the first time. On Earth, the memorials still stood in their silent rows. 50 billion names carved into stone and crystal and light. And humanity never forgot what they had lost and why they had become what they were. But beside those memorials, new monuments began to rise. Names of alien worlds that now called humanity friend were added to growing lists of partnerships and alliances, and records of civilizations saved from destruction and species lifted from poverty and conflicts, resolved without bloodshed, filled new archives that grew larger every year. Captain Vasquez retired from active service after 10 years of diplomatic work, and she returned to Earth to spend her remaining days in a small house by the ocean, where she could watch the sunrise and remember everyone she had lost and everyone she had saved. A reporter asked her once if she was proud of what humanity had accomplished, and she thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Pride is a dangerous thing," she said. "It was pride that made the precursors attack the first harvester ship. And it was pride that convinced the Koroth they could defeat us through strength alone. And it was pride that let empires convince themselves that slavery and genocide were acceptable prices for power." She looked out at the ocean and remembered the stars. "What I feel is not pride but hope," she said. "Hope that we have planted seeds that will grow into something better than what came before. And hope that the galaxy we leave behind will be worthy of all the suffering that was required to build it." She smiled. And it was the same gentle smile she had worn when she first appeared on galactic screens. 6 months after emerging from the void, one human warship entered the galaxy, and every empire fell silent, she said. But silence was never the goal, and fear was never the point. And what we really wanted was for them to listen. She turned to face the reporter. "And now they are listening. And now the real work begins. I believe that one day they will look back at this moment and understand that the silence was not an ending but a beginning." Behind her, the sun rose over an ocean that had witnessed humanity's birth and near death and transformation. And across the galaxy, civilizations that had once seemed eternal were learning to become something new. The age of empires was ending. The age of cooperation was just beginning, and humanity, forged in loss and tempered by grief and armed with hope, stood ready to light the way forward into a future that no one could have imagined, before a single warship emerged from the darkness and changed everything.